Sometimes the greatest treasure isn't hidden from the world. It's hidden from the people who stopped believing they were worth finding. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your state or country in the comments below. And if you believe every loyal dog deserves a second chance and every veteran deserves to come home with dignity, take a moment to like this video and join us for another unforgettable story. Now let's begin. The early morning air over Billings, Montana, carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves mixed with diesel fumes drifting across the industrial district. Thin streaks of pale sunlight slipped through layers of gray clouds, painting long shadows over rows of aging storage buildings that had stood quietly for decades. Their faded steel doors wore scratches, rust, and forgotten numbers like old soldiers wearing medals no one remembered anymore. Pickup trucks rolled into the gravel parking lot one after another, their tires crunching over loose stones while auction regulars climbed out, carrying steaming paper cups of coffee. Some laughed loudly. Others checked handwritten lists, hoping today's auction might hold an antique motorcycle, rare collectibles, or something valuable enough to flip for quick cash. Standing farther away near the edge of the lot was a man nobody seemed to notice until they noticed his dog. Ethan Walker adjusted the worn collar of his faded canvas jacket against the cold breeze. At 41 years old, the former Navy SEAL looked older than his age. Months of sleeping inside an aging pickup truck had carved quiet exhaustion into his face. Yet his posture still carried the discipline that years of military service refused to surrender. His short brown hair had begun turning gray near the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a face weathered by sun, wind, and disappointment rather than bitterness. His blue eyes moved slowly across the auction yard, observing every detail with the calm patience that had once kept teammates alive during impossible missions. Beside him sat Ranger, a magnificent German shepherd with a rich sable coat glowing softly beneath the rising sun. His amber eyes never wandered far from Ethan. Every small movement of his owner was answered with a gentle flick of his ears or the quiet shift of a protective stance. They had shared too many lonely mornings together to need words anymore. Ethan reached into his pocket and counted the money one final time. $85, 3 20s, 110, 15, the last cash he possessed in the entire world. He folded the bills carefully and slipped them back inside his wallet as though protecting something far more valuable than paper. Around him, conversations floated through the cool air. That one's probably full of junk. Unit 23 sold last month for $8,000. Watch somebody get lucky today. Ethan smiled faintly without looking toward the voices. Luck had never been something he expected. Surviving difficult seasons had always depended on quieter things. Discipline, faith, endurance. Ranger gently nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. Ethan scratched behind the shepherd's ears. "Whatever happens," he whispered softly, "we face it together." The auctioneer climbed onto the small trailer serving as a temporary stage and adjusted the microphone. One storage unit after another opened before eager bidders. Old furniture, fishing gear, boxes filled with clothes, broken appliances. Every door lifted revealed another forgotten chapter of someone else's life. Prices rose quickly as experienced buyers competed with confident smiles. Ethan watched silently, refusing to chase excitement. He had learned long ago that emotion often cost more than patience. Nearly an hour passed before the auctioneer stopped beside one of the oldest units near the back corner of the property. The faded number 117 barely remained visible beneath layers of chipped paint. Thick dust coated the metal door, and spiderwebs stretched across the corners untouched for years. "Looks like this one hasn't been opened in a very long time," the auctioneer joked, drawing scattered laughter from the crowd. When the heavy door rattled upward, sunlight spilled inside only a few feet before disappearing into darkness. From where everyone stood, the contents looked utterly disappointing. A broken rocking chair leaned against one wall. Several cracked moving boxes sat collapsed beneath decades of dust. An old bicycle frame without wheels rested sideways beside a warped wooden cabinet. Cobwebs covered nearly everything. One man chuckled, "I'd pay $5 just to bulldoze it." Another laughed louder. "There's your retirement fund." Even Ethan couldn't see anything worth saving. But Ranger could not take his eyes off the storage unit. The shepherd stood perfectly still. His ears rose high. His breathing slowed. Instead of looking toward the scattered junk like everyone else, he focused somewhere deeper inside the darkness beyond what sunlight could reach. Ethan noticed immediately. Ranger almost never stared without reason. The dog took one careful step forward, then another. His tail remained perfectly level. Not excited, not afraid, focused. Ethan quietly followed the direction of Ranger's gaze, but saw nothing except shadows stretching toward the back wall. Opening bid, the auctioneer called. $50. Nobody answered. A light breeze rolled through the lot, carrying the scent of old wood and dry concrete from inside the forgotten unit. Ranger inhaled once more and remained frozen, his amber eyes locked on something hidden far beyond the piles of abandoned junk. Ethan felt an old instinct awaken inside him, the same instinct that had taught him years ago to trust his partner before trusting his own eyes. Without fully understanding why, he slowly reached into his pocket, wrapped his fingers around every dollar he had left, and raised his hand. The auctioneer glanced toward Ethan, raised one eyebrow, and nodded. "I've got $85. Do I hear 90? Silence settled over the gravel lot. A few bidders exchanged amused looks before one man shrugged and shook his head. Another took a sip of coffee and chuckled under his breath. "Let him have it," someone muttered. "He's buying himself a pile of firewood." The auctioneer lifted the gavel. Going once, going twice, sold for $85. The sound of wood striking wood echoed across the quiet storage yard. Just like that, every dollar Ethan Walker owned belonged to someone else, and Unit 117 belonged to him. If you're enjoying this journey so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more inspiring stories about loyalty, hope, and second chances. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Ethan accepted the small ring of keys with a grateful nod. There was no celebration, no triumphant smile, only the calm expression of a man who had learned that expectations often weighed more than reality. Ranger walked beside him without pulling on the leash, his amber eyes never leaving the open doorway. As the other buyers drifted toward the next auction, conversations faded into the distance until only the gentle whistle of the Montana breeze remained. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight inside the storage unit, giving the air the appearance of tiny golden stars suspended in silence. Ethan stepped across the worn concrete floor, and every footstep stirred years of forgotten dirt into the cool air. The smell was unmistakable. Old pine wood, dry cardboard, rusted metal, faint traces of machine oil. It smelled less like treasure and more like time itself had been locked behind the steel door. He knelt beside the nearest moving box and carefully brushed away a thick layer of dust. The cardboard nearly crumbled beneath his fingertips. Inside lay nothing more than faded magazines, cracked picture frames, and a collection of outdated kitchen utensils wrapped in yellowed newspaper. Ethan smiled quietly. Someone once thought these were worth saving. Ranger wandered only a few feet before stopping again. He sniffed the air once, then twice. But instead of exploring the scattered furniture like an ordinary dog, he turned his attention toward the deepest corner of the unit where sunlight barely reached. Ethan continued sorting through the contents. A warped dresser with missing drawers. A broken lamp. An old camping chair that collapsed the moment he unfolded it. A stack of empty paint cans. Nothing suggested value. Nothing hinted at fortune. Every object seemed to confirm what the crowd had believed. He had spent his last $85 on someone else's forgotten disappointments. Yet Ethan never cursed his decision. During his years in the Navy, he had learned that judging an outcome too early often blinded people to what mattered most. Ranger released a soft whine. Not loud, not anxious, just enough to make Ethan look up. The shepherd stood perfectly still beside the rear wall, nose lifted slightly, as though following an invisible trail carried through the stale air. Ethan watched carefully. Ranger rarely barked without purpose, and he almost never whined. The behavior reminded Ethan of long training exercises years ago when the dog would detect something no human eye could immediately recognize. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan asked gently. Ranger looked back for only a moment before returning his gaze to the same section of the wall. Ethan walked over, expecting perhaps a mouse or another small animal hidden behind old shelving. He tapped lightly against the wooden paneling. The sound seemed ordinary, solid enough. He knocked again a few inches away. This time the tone changed ever so slightly. Hollow. Ethan frowned. He stepped back and studied the wall more carefully. The boards were old, but one section appeared straighter than the rest, almost as though someone had repaired it many years ago using newer lumber that had simply aged alongside everything else. Interesting, he whispered. Before examining it further, he decided to finish clearing the space. Piece by piece, he carried useless items toward the entrance. The old bicycle frame, rotten cushions, splintered shelves, a cracked mirror reflecting fragments of the pale Montana sky. Sweat formed beneath his jacket despite the cool morning air. Nearly 2 hours passed before the floor opened enough to reveal the full length of the back wall. Ranger never wandered away. He never asked for water. He never chased birds fluttering outside the unit. He simply waited with unwavering patience, eyes fixed on the same place, as if honoring a silent promise only he could understand. Ethan sat down on the edge of the old rocking chair, wiping dust from his hands with a faded handkerchief. He reached into his backpack, removed a bottle of water, and shared the last few ounces with Ranger before taking a small sip himself. "Looks like we bought ourselves a cleaning project," he said with a tired smile. Ranger accepted the water gratefully, but immediately returned to the wall. Ethan laughed softly. "You're more stubborn than I am." The shepherd's ears lifted at the familiar sound of Ethan's voice. For the first time that morning, his tail gave a slow, deliberate wag. Not because he was playing. Not because he wanted food. It was almost as if he believed they were getting closer to something worth finding. Ethan rose once more, walked toward the wall, and rested his hand against the weathered boards. The wood felt unexpectedly cool beneath his fingertips despite the warming day outside. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening. The storage unit had grown remarkably quiet. Even the distant auction seemed far away now. Only the faint rustle of dry leaves outside and Ranger's steady breathing filled the silence. Then the German shepherd placed one paw gently against the lowest board and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. It was the same silent signal Ethan had trusted countless times before, and something deep inside him whispered that this forgotten storage unit might not be finished telling its story. There are moments when experience tells you to walk away, and there are moments when trust asks you to stay one step longer. Ethan kept his hand against the weathered boards, feeling the cool grain beneath his fingertips, while Ranger remained perfectly still beside him. The German shepherd's breathing was slow and measured, his amber eyes focused on the exact spot where his paw rested against the wall. Ethan had seen that look before. Years ago, it had appeared on dusty training fields, inside abandoned buildings, and during long search exercises where Ranger somehow sensed details no map could ever reveal. He had learned not to ignore it. He picked up an old rubber mallet lying near the broken cabinet and gently tapped across the wall from left to right. Knock, knock, knock. Every strike echoed softly through the storage unit until one section answered with a noticeably different sound. Hollow. Ethan paused. He tapped again this time, more carefully. The same dull, empty echo returned. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make years of careful observation come rushing back. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he whispered. Ranger's ears twitched, and his tail gave one slow sweep across the dusty concrete floor. Ethan crouched closer and brushed years of dirt away with the sleeve of his jacket. Beneath the grime, he noticed something almost invisible. The nails securing 4 of the wooden planks were newer than the others. Not new by any means, but newer. Whoever had built this section had done so with unusual care, matching the aged lumber closely enough that casual visitors would never notice the difference. Ethan smiled quietly. Somebody wanted this to disappear. Sunlight shifted across the open doorway as the morning stretched toward noon. Outside, the auction crowd had long since disappeared, leaving the storage facility wrapped in peaceful silence. A gentle breeze drifted through the open unit, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant pine trees from the hills beyond Billings. Dust floated lazily through the warm light, while Ranger sat patiently beside Ethan, never taking his eyes off the hidden section. Ethan searched the pile of discarded tools and found an old flat pry bar beneath a cracked toolbox. The metal was rusty but solid. He carefully slipped the tip beneath the edge of one board and applied gentle pressure. The wood creaked but refused to move. He stopped immediately rather than forcing it. "Easy," he murmured, almost speaking to the wall as much as to himself. No reason to rush. Years in the military had taught him that patience often accomplished what strength never could. He examined the surrounding frame more closely, tracing each seam with his fingertips. There, a tiny gap no wider than a nickel, barely visible beneath layers of dust. He inserted the pry bar again, this time at a slightly different angle. The board eased forward less than half an inch before settling with a soft pop. Ranger stood immediately, not excited, not barking, simply alert, watching every movement with complete concentration. Ethan removed the first plank and leaned it carefully against the wall. Behind it, there was no stack of gold bars, no glittering treasure, no dramatic surprise waiting in the shadows. Instead, he found another layer. Smooth gray concrete. He blinked in confusion. Concrete, he said under his breath. It made no sense. Why would someone build a wooden wall only to hide another wall behind it? Ranger stepped closer and lowered his nose toward the bottom corner where the concrete met the floor. He sniffed slowly, then looked back at Ethan once again. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and noticed something he had missed before. Along the lower edge of the concrete ran a thin line, almost perfectly concealed beneath years of dust. It wasn't a crack. It was too straight. It looked more like the outline of a doorway poured into the wall itself. Ethan carefully wiped away more dirt with his handkerchief. Inch by inch, the faint rectangular shape became easier to see. It stretched almost 7 feet high and roughly 3 feet wide. Not a random patch of concrete. A sealed entrance. His heartbeat quickened, though his expression remained calm. Who builds a room inside a storage unit? He wondered aloud. The question lingered unanswered in the quiet air. Ranger rested against Ethan's leg for only a moment before returning his attention to the hidden outline. Ethan smiled at his loyal companion. Looks like you weren't chasing ghosts after all. He sat back on the concrete floor, studying every detail before making another move. Whatever lay beyond that hidden entrance had remained untouched for many years. If there were documents, they could be fragile. If there were keepsakes, they deserved care. Even if there was nothing at all, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect whatever once mattered enough to hide. Ethan slowly reached into his backpack, removed a small flashlight, and swept its beam across the concrete surface. Near the upper right corner, barely visible beneath layers of dust, something caught the light. A small circular piece of brushed steel, no larger than a silver dollar, sat perfectly flush with the wall. It wasn't decoration. It wasn't random construction hardware. It looked very much like part of a concealed locking mechanism. Ethan leaned closer, his curiosity growing with every passing second, while Ranger remained silent beside him, watching the hidden door with unwavering confidence, as though he had known from the very beginning that the real story had never been inside the pile of forgotten junk, but waiting patiently behind the wall where almost everyone else had chosen not to look. The smallest discoveries often ask the biggest questions. Ethan remained kneeling before the hidden concrete outline, his flashlight casting a steady beam across the smooth surface while Ranger waited beside him with remarkable patience. The little circle of brushed steel reflected the light just enough to catch his attention again. It wasn't a handle, and it wasn't decorative. It had been installed with precision, almost flush with the concrete, as though whoever built this place had expected only one person to know it was there. Ethan reached out slowly and brushed away another layer of dust. Fine gray powder drifted through the air before settling quietly onto the floor. Around the steel disc, faint markings gradually appeared. They weren't words, only tiny reference lines arranged in a careful pattern, nearly invisible after years of neglect. Ethan tilted his head. This wasn't built in a hurry, he murmured. Someone took their time. Ranger leaned forward and sniffed the edge of the concrete once more before sitting back on his haunches, calm but attentive. His ears remained upright, following every tiny sound inside the silent storage unit. Outside, the afternoon breeze rattled a loose chain-link fence somewhere beyond the rows of storage buildings, while a distant freight train rolled across the Montana prairie with its familiar low whistle. The peaceful sound somehow made the hidden doorway feel even more mysterious. Ethan searched through the old toolbox again until he found a flathead screwdriver. He gently inserted the tip beneath the steel disc and gave it the slightest twist. Nothing happened. He tried pressing the center instead. Again, nothing. Rather than forcing it, he paused. Years of specialized training had taught him that hidden mechanisms often rewarded observation more than strength. He studied the surrounding concrete again, this time letting his eyes move slowly from corner to corner. Then he noticed something almost impossible to see unless the sunlight struck at exactly the right angle. For tiny metal pins sat along the frame, one near each corner of the concealed rectangle. They blended perfectly into the concrete, disguised beneath layers of age and dust. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're clever," he whispered, speaking to the unknown craftsman who had built it decades earlier. Using the screwdriver, he carefully pressed the first pin. A soft click echoed inside the wall. Ranger immediately lifted his head. Ethan pressed the second. Another click. Then the third. Finally the fourth. For several quiet seconds, nothing happened. Ethan almost wondered if the mechanism had rusted solid with time. Then a gentle sound rolled through the concrete, deep and mechanical, followed by the faint scrape of old steel moving against hidden guides. A narrow seam appeared where none had existed before. It widened less than half an inch, just enough for a cool breath of air to drift into the storage unit. Ethan instinctively inhaled. The air smelled surprisingly clean, carrying faint traces of cedar wood, aged paper, and dry leather rather than mold or decay. Whatever space had been hidden behind the wall had somehow remained remarkably well preserved. Ranger stood immediately and stepped closer, his nose following the fresh current of air. His tail moved slowly from side to side, not with excitement, but with quiet confidence, as though confirming they were finally on the right path. Ethan wrapped both hands around the edge of the concealed door and pulled gently. The heavy slab moved with surprising balance, pivoting silently on concealed hinges that still worked after countless years. Beyond it lay a narrow room, no more than 8 feet wide and perhaps 12 feet deep. Ethan remained motionless in the doorway for several seconds. It wasn't filled with stacks of cash or glittering piles of gold. Instead, everything inside had been arranged with extraordinary care. Wooden shelves lined both walls. Dust covered every surface, yet nothing appeared disturbed. A sturdy oak desk stood near the back beneath a single hanging light fixture that had long since gone dark. Along one wall rested several neatly labeled storage trunks, each identical in size and color. A faded American flag sat carefully folded inside a glass display case mounted above the desk. Beside it hung an old framed photograph turned slightly away from the entrance, its image hidden beneath years of dust. Ethan stepped inside slowly, every footfall echoing softly across the concrete floor. Ranger followed close beside him without wandering, almost as though he understood this room deserved respect. Ethan removed his cap instinctively when his eyes settled on the folded flag. He didn't know who had built this place or why it had remained hidden, but something about the careful arrangement spoke of honor rather than greed. His flashlight beam drifted across the oak desk until it landed on a small brass nameplate resting neatly at the center. He knelt and gently wiped away the dust with his handkerchief. The engraved letters slowly emerged beneath the cloth. Captain Benjamin Mercer, U.S. Navy. Ethan stared quietly at the name for several long seconds. The title, the branch of service, the careful preservation of every item in the room. None of it suggested an ordinary storage locker anymore. It felt less like forgotten property and more like a chapter of someone's life that had been intentionally sealed away. Ranger walked toward the desk, then stopped beside the largest storage trunk in the room. He lowered his nose, inhaled once, and looked back at Ethan with the same calm certainty that had guided every step since the auction began. Ethan crossed the room, rested one hand on the weathered wooden lid, and noticed a small brass latch that had never been forced open. Whatever answers had survived all these years were waiting inside, untouched by time, waiting for someone patient enough and honest enough to find them. For a long moment, Ethan simply rested his hand on the weathered brass latch without lifting it. The room felt strangely peaceful, as though time itself had agreed to wait behind these walls. Ranger sat quietly beside the trunk, his amber eyes following Ethan with complete trust. There was no urgency in the dog's posture now. Whatever instinct had guided him to this hidden room seemed to have settled into quiet certainty. Ethan drew a slow breath and released the latch. The hinges answered with a soft creak that echoed gently through the chamber. Inside, there were no overflowing piles of cash or glittering jewels. Instead, Everything had been arranged with remarkable care. A folded navy dress uniform rested neatly on top, protected beneath a clean linen cloth that had yellowed with age. Beside it lay a polished wooden presentation box, a leather journal bound with a faded strap, several carefully labeled document envelopes, and a small velvet pouch. Ethan removed the journal first. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and the first page carried a handwritten inscription in careful blue ink. If someone honest is reading this, then perhaps these things have found the right hands. Ethan paused, reading the sentence twice before turning the page. The entries were not written like military reports. They were reflections of a man who had spent decades recording memories, hopes, and lessons learned through service and family. Captain Benjamin Mercer described quiet mornings on the Chesapeake Bay, letters from his wife, the birth of his daughter, and his belief that wealth should always serve people instead of controlling them. Ethan found himself smiling at passages about teaching neighborhood children how to fish and helping young sailors prepare for their first deployments. The words carried warmth rather than regret. Ranger gently nudged Ethan's elbow, drawing his attention toward the velvet pouch. Ethan loosened the drawstring and carefully poured the contents into his palm. Several old gold coins caught the afternoon light, their surfaces glowing softly despite the years they had spent hidden away. They were beautiful, certainly valuable, but what surprised Ethan more was the handwritten note folded beneath them. Emergency reserve. Never intended for luxury, only for hope. Ethan quietly returned every coin to the pouch, exactly as he had found them. He opened one of the document envelopes next. Inside were stock certificates issued decades earlier, each protected in clear sleeves. Some belonged to companies whose names Ethan recognized immediately. Others had long since merged into larger corporations. Even without calculating exact numbers, he understood they could represent significant value after all these years. Yet another envelope contained property records, family photographs, handwritten letters, and legal documents bearing official seals. Nothing suggested hidden criminal dealings or secret fortunes acquired dishonestly. Instead, the collection looked like the carefully preserved legacy of a man who had planned thoughtfully but never completed the final chapter of his estate. Ethan leaned back in the wooden chair beside the desk, absorbing the quiet weight of the discovery. Outside, sunlight stretched lower across the storage yard, filling the hidden room with warm golden light that reflected gently from the glass case holding the folded American flag. Dust drifted through the air like tiny floating memories. Ranger wandered to the framed photograph hanging on the wall and sat beneath it. Ethan stood, lifted the frame carefully from its hook, and wiped away decades of dust with his sleeve. The photograph revealed a smiling family standing beside a white farmhouse beneath a broad oak tree. Captain Mercer stood proudly in the center wearing civilian clothes, one arm around a woman whose smile radiated kindness. Between them stood a little girl holding the leash of a young German Shepherd puppy. On the back of the frame, written in neat script, were the words, "Home is never a place. Home is the people who wait for you." Ethan swallowed quietly. Those words reached somewhere deep inside him, reminding him of everything he had lost and everything he still hoped to rebuild. He looked down at Ranger, who returned his gaze with the calm loyalty only years of companionship could create. "Looks like you found more than a room, partner," Ethan whispered. "You found someone's life." He carefully returned every document to its proper place before closing the trunk halfway, unwilling to disturb the careful order that Captain Mercer had preserved. The discovery had answered one question, but created many more. Who was the little girl in the photograph? Had she ever known this room existed? Why had such a carefully planned legacy remained hidden inside an abandoned storage unit for so many years? As Ethan's eyes drifted across the desk one final time, he noticed a single unopened envelope resting beneath the brass nameplate. Unlike the others, it bore no legal markings. Only 4 handwritten words appeared across the front in dark blue ink, "To the finder alone." Ethan reached toward it slowly, realizing that whatever came next might explain why fate had brought a weary veteran and his faithful German shepherd to this forgotten place on an ordinary autumn morning. Some letters are meant to deliver information. Others quietly change the direction of a person's life. Ethan held the envelope for several moments before carefully breaking the aged seal. The paper inside had yellowed gently over the years, but the handwriting remained steady and remarkably clear. He unfolded the single page while Ranger settled beside his boots, watching in patient silence. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then life has carried you through a door that few people were ever meant to open. I do not know your name, your profession, or the burdens you have carried. But I hope you value honesty more than convenience, because everything in this room belongs first to the truth." Ethan lowered the page for a moment and looked around the hidden chamber once again. The folded flag, the trunks, the photographs. None of it felt accidental anymore. He continued reading. Captain Benjamin Mercer explained that after retiring from the Navy, he had spent years investing patiently, building a modest fortune that he intended to leave to his family and to several charitable foundations supporting veterans and service dogs. Before he could complete every legal arrangement, unexpected complications within the management of his estate caused him to question whether the documents would ever reach the right people. Rather than allowing years of work to disappear into confusion, he created the hidden room and placed complete records there, hoping that one day an honest person would ensure everything reached its rightful destination. Ethan quietly exhaled. The story was becoming clearer, yet one question remained unanswered. Why had no one ever found the room? Turning another page, he discovered the explanation. The storage unit had originally belonged to a trusted business partner who passed away unexpectedly. Ownership of several properties changed hands over the years. Records became incomplete, rental payments stopped, and eventually the forgotten unit entered the auction system without anyone realizing a concealed room existed behind the rear wall. It was an extraordinary chain of ordinary mistakes. Ranger lifted his head as a faint breeze drifted through the open storage unit outside, carrying the scent of dry grass and late afternoon sunshine. Ethan reached down and gently rubbed the shepherd's neck. "Looks like you solved a mystery nobody even knew existed," he said with a grateful smile. He returned to the letter. The final paragraphs were deeply personal. Captain Mercer wrote about loyalty, describing how the German shepherd in the family photograph had remained faithfully beside his daughter through every season of childhood. He believed dogs recognized character before people did, and he admitted that if a loyal dog had guided someone into the room, perhaps that person deserved an opportunity to make the next decision. There was no demand, no legal instruction, only a simple request. "Please find my family if they can still be found. If they cannot, make certain these resources help those who served with honor and those who still need hope." Ethan folded the letter carefully, his thoughts lingering on the final sentence. He had entered the storage unit expecting broken furniture and discarded belongings. Instead, he had become the guardian of another man's unfinished promise. He stood and walked toward the desk, where an old address book rested neatly beside a fountain pen. Many of the pages listed names with outdated phone numbers and handwritten notes in the margins. Several entries had been crossed out over time, but one page contained a different notation written in darker ink. Beside the name Emily Mercer appeared a city in Oregon and the words, "Last confirmed Christmas card." Ethan recognized immediately that decades had passed since those words were written. The address might no longer be valid. The phone number almost certainly wasn't. Even so, it was a beginning. He placed the address book gently into his backpack along with the letter, leaving every other item exactly where it belonged. Nothing would leave the hidden room until he understood the full story and could protect Captain Mercer's wishes. Before closing the largest trunk, Ethan noticed a slim metal box tucked beneath the folded uniform. Inside rested several neatly labeled keys attached to brass tags. One read, "Safety Deposit." Another simply read, "Office." A third carried no words at all, only the engraved number 27. Ethan studied them thoughtfully before returning the box to its place. Outside, the afternoon light had softened into warm amber, casting long beams across the storage unit floor. Shadows stretched quietly between the shelves while Ranger walked toward the concealed doorway and paused, looking not back into the hidden room, but toward the open entrance leading outside. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and realized that discovering the room had never been the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Billings, someone might still be waiting for answers they had stopped expecting many years ago. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan Walker felt something stronger than uncertainty settling into his heart. He felt purpose. The hardest decisions rarely arrive with raised voices. More often, they appear in perfect silence, asking only one question: who will you choose to become? Ethan locked the concealed room exactly as he had found it, carefully returning each wooden plank to its place before closing the storage unit for the evening. The Montana sky had turned a deep shade of amber, and the cool air carried the familiar scent of sagebrush and distant rain drifting across the plains. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat of the old pickup and settled comfortably against the worn blanket that had become his bed over the past several months. Ethan remained standing outside the truck for another minute, his hand resting on the roof as he looked back toward Unit 117. 24 hours earlier, it had been nothing more than another forgotten storage locker. Now it carried the weight of another man's final promise. During the drive into town, neither man nor dog hurried. The engine hummed steadily along quiet county roads while the last light of day painted the rolling fields in soft shades of gold. Ethan stopped at a small public library just before closing time. It was the kind of brick building that had served generations of local families, where the scent of old books mixed with polished wood and fresh coffee from a volunteer-run reading corner. Ranger waited patiently outside beneath a maple tree while Ethan stepped inside, carrying only the address book and Captain Mercer's letter. The librarian, a gray-haired woman named Margaret Collins, greeted him with a warm smile that carried neither pity nor curiosity. She simply asked how she could help. Ethan explained that he was searching for information about a Navy veteran and a family that might have moved decades earlier. Margaret listened carefully before guiding him toward public genealogy records and archived newspaper databases. For nearly 2 hours, Ethan searched patiently through digital records, local archives, and historical directories. Most of the addresses had long disappeared. Telephone numbers had been disconnected years before. Businesses had closed. Neighborhoods had changed. Still, small pieces slowly began fitting together. Captain Benjamin Mercer had indeed lived exactly where the documents suggested. His wife had passed away many years earlier. His daughter, Emily Mercer, appeared to have relocated to the Oregon coast sometime in the early 2000s. One brief newspaper article mentioned her work as a volunteer supporting military families after natural disasters. Ethan leaned back in his chair, quietly absorbing the discovery. She had not vanished. She had simply continued living her life. Margaret noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. Sometimes, she said gently, people stop looking because they believe no one is still searching. Ethan smiled gratefully. Maybe it's time someone started again. As they walked back toward the truck beneath a sky now filled with early stars, Ranger greeted Ethan with his usual calm enthusiasm, pressing his head gently against Ethan's side. Ethan scratched behind the shepherd's ears and laughed softly. Looks like we're heading to Oregon, partner. Ranger's tail swept happily across the pavement, earning an amused smile from Margaret before she wished them safe travels. That night, Ethan parked along the edge of a quiet campground outside Billings. He couldn't afford a cabin, but the public area allowed overnight parking, and the gentle sound of a nearby creek offered a rare sense of peace. Sitting beneath the open tailgate, he shared a simple meal with Ranger, sandwiches for himself, kibble and fresh water for his loyal companion. The stars above shone with remarkable clarity, scattered across the Montana sky like countless distant lanterns. Ethan unfolded Captain Mercer's letter one more time, reading the final paragraph beneath the soft glow of a small camping lantern. The words carried even greater meaning now than they had earlier that afternoon. This journey was no longer about discovering wealth. It was about returning something precious that time had accidentally hidden. Ranger rested his head across Ethan's boot, closing his eyes as the cool night breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees nearby. Ethan looked down at his faithful friend and realized something had quietly changed inside him. For months he had measured every day by what he lacked: a permanent home, stable work, certainty about tomorrow. Now, for the first time in a long while, he found himself thinking instead about what he could give. The road ahead would be long, and there were still many unanswered questions waiting beyond the mountains to the west. But as the lantern flickered gently beside them and the peaceful sounds of the creek filled the darkness, Ethan no longer felt like a man wandering without direction. Thanks to one extraordinary German shepherd and one forgotten promise, he finally had a destination worth following. Morning arrived quietly along the Oregon coast, where a blanket of pale mist drifted inland from the Pacific and wrapped itself around evergreen hills. Ethan guided the aging pickup through narrow coastal roads while Ranger sat upright beside him, watching the landscape change from open prairie to towering spruce forests and weathered fishing towns. The journey had taken 2 days, with little more than roadside diners, rest stops, and quiet campgrounds marking the miles. Yet neither man nor dog seemed eager to hurry. Some destinations deserve to be approached with patience. According to the address book, Emily Mercer's last known residence stood near a small harbor where colorful fishing boats rocked gently against wooden docks. The neighborhood was modest, lined with white cottages, flowering gardens, and front porches that overlooked the sea. Salt filled the cool morning air, mingling with the scent of cedar and freshly brewed coffee drifting from nearby homes. Ethan parked across the street and sat silently for a moment. Ranger looked toward a pale blue house with white trim, then back at Ethan as if asking the same question that rested in his own mind. Was this finally the place? Ethan stepped out, adjusted the collar of his jacket, and carried only the leather journal and Captain Mercer's letter beneath his arm. The rest remained safely secured until he understood who stood behind the front door. Ranger walked calmly beside him, his leash hanging loose. As they reached the porch, Ethan noticed a brass wind chime moving gently in the ocean breeze. The sound was soft, almost musical, carrying an unexpected sense of peace. He knocked once. No answer. He waited respectfully before knocking again. After several quiet seconds, the door opened just wide enough to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair gathered into a loose braid. Her warm hazel eyes studied Ethan with understandable caution before drifting toward Ranger. The German shepherd sat politely without making a sound. "Good morning," Ethan said gently. "I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm looking for Emily Mercer." The woman's expression shifted ever so slightly. "I'm Emily," she answered. "How can I help you?" Ethan suddenly found himself searching for words that no journey had prepared him to speak. Instead of answering immediately, he carefully held out the old leather journal. Emily's eyes widened before she even touched it. Her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed across the familiar worn cover. She opened the first page, stared at the handwriting, and quietly covered her mouth. For several moments, she could not speak. Tears gathered gently in her eyes, not from sadness alone, but from the overwhelming surprise of seeing something she believed had been lost forever. "This was my father's," she whispered. Ethan nodded softly. "I believe so." Emily looked toward Ranger, then back at Ethan. "Please," she said, opening the door wider. "Come inside." The home reflected a lifetime of quiet kindness. Family photographs lined the mantel. Seashells collected over many summers rested on wooden shelves. A faded navy portrait hung beside a simple watercolor painting of the coast. Everything carried the comforting feeling of a place built through memories rather than possessions. They sat together at a small oak table near the kitchen window while morning sunlight slowly dissolved the mist outside. Ethan told the story carefully from the beginning, explaining the storage auction, Ranger's unusual behavior, the concealed room, and Captain Mercer's letter. He chose each word thoughtfully, allowing Emily time to absorb every detail without rushing the conversation. She listened without interrupting, occasionally smiling through tears as familiar memories returned. When Ethan finished, the room remained quiet except for the distant cry of seagulls drifting in from the harbor. Emily reached across the table and gently rested her hand upon the journal. "My father always believed that character revealed itself when no one was watching," she said softly. "He used to tell me that honesty was the one possession nobody could take away." She looked directly at Ethan. "You could have walked away with everything." Ethan smiled faintly and glanced toward Ranger, who had settled peacefully near the fireplace. "I don't think my partner would have approved." Emily laughed for the first time that morning, the sound warm and genuine. She crossed the room and returned carrying an old family photo album. Together, they compared the photographs from the hidden room with the pictures preserved in her home. Every face matched. Every memory found its place. By the time the afternoon sun reached the windows, the mystery that had remained buried for decades had finally become a family story once again. Yet Ethan knew the journey was not entirely complete. The hidden room still waited in Montana, along with Captain Mercer's carefully preserved legacy. Emily gently folded her father's letter and looked toward the ocean beyond the window. "He trusted the right person," she said quietly. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Ranger sleeping peacefully in a patch of sunlight on the wooden floor and realized that sometimes the greatest acts of faith begin with something as simple as choosing to follow where loyalty leads. Some promises take a lifetime to fulfill, and sometimes they are completed by people who were never meant to meet. 2 weeks later, Ethan and Ranger returned to Montana with Emily Mercer by their side. The autumn leaves had begun turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the quiet storage facility. Standing before Unit 117 once again, Emily paused for a long moment before stepping inside. Her eyes wandered across the familiar shelves, the folded American flag, the oak desk, and finally the photograph that had waited patiently in silence for so many years. She smiled through grateful tears, not because she had recovered material possessions, but because she had recovered a part of her father's story that she believed had disappeared forever. Together, they carefully documented every item in the hidden room before contacting an attorney and local authorities so the estate could be handled properly and transparently. Every record matched Captain Mercer's written instructions. The investments, after years of growth, had become far more valuable than anyone expected. Yet what impressed everyone involved was not the amount itself, but the extraordinary care with which every document had been preserved. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had been taken. Ethan had protected another man's legacy before knowing whether he would ever receive anything in return. Over the following months, Captain Mercer's final wishes were carried out exactly as he had hoped. A substantial portion of the estate supported organizations serving veterans and retired military working dogs. Another portion remained with Emily and her family, restoring a legacy that had almost been lost to time. When every legal matter had been completed, Emily asked Ethan to meet her beneath the old oak tree shown in the family photograph. The farmhouse no longer stood, but the tree still stretched proudly toward the sky, its branches sheltering generations of memories. Ranger wandered through the tall grass, happily chasing falling leaves before returning to sit beside Ethan as though he understood this moment belonged to all of them. Emily handed Ethan a neatly folded envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a certified check. Ethan looked up immediately. "I can't accept this," he said gently. Emily smiled with quiet certainty. "You already accepted the responsibility," she replied. "Now let us honor my father's gratitude." She explained that Captain Mercer had included one final provision within his estate. If an honest stranger ever reunited his family with the hidden room, that person was to receive a meaningful gift, not as payment, but as recognition that integrity deserved to be rewarded. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the letter. It contained only one sentence written in Captain Mercer's familiar handwriting. "May this help you build the home that loyalty already found." For several moments Ethan could not speak. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's knee, his calm presence saying everything words could not. Months later, on a quiet piece of land just outside Billings, a modest wooden building welcomed its first visitors. A simple sign near the entrance read, "Mercer House." It was neither grand nor luxurious. Instead, it offered temporary housing, practical assistance, and companionship for veterans rebuilding their lives alongside rescued German shepherds waiting for families of their own. Every room carried reminders of hope rather than loss. Captain Mercer's folded flag rested inside a place of honor near the entrance with Emily's blessing. The old photograph hung nearby, reminding every visitor that kindness can travel across generations. Ranger quickly became the unofficial greeter, patiently meeting each newcomer with the same quiet confidence that had led Ethan to the hidden room months earlier. Some visitors arrived carrying heavy burdens. Others simply needed someone to believe in them again. Ranger welcomed each one with a gentle wag of his tail, proving that healing sometimes begins before a single word is spoken. One cool evening, after the last visitor had gone home, Ethan sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of amber and violet. Ranger stretched out beside him, resting comfortably after another busy day. The wind moved softly through the nearby pines, carrying with it the familiar scent of earth after rain. Ethan looked toward the distant horizon and thought about the morning he had spent his last $85 on what everyone else considered worthless. He smiled quietly. The greatest treasure had never been hidden inside a trunk, a document, or a forgotten room. It had been hidden inside a choice. The choice to trust. The choice to be honest when no one was watching. The choice to believe that loyalty still matters in a world that often rushes past it. Ranger lifted his head as if sensing the thought, and Ethan gently scratched behind his ears. "Good job, partner," he whispered. "You found exactly what we needed." As the evening settled peacefully across the valley, the lights inside Mercer House began to glow one by one, welcoming strangers who would soon become neighbors, neighbors who would become friends, and stories that would continue long after this one had ended. Because some endings are not really endings at all. They are quiet beginnings, built by faithful hearts, steady hands, and the extraordinary grace of doing the right thing even when nobody expects it.